So a lot of people have been asking me, Ecor, what do you think the best decks are going to be when the nerfs come out, because they've been officially like announced that they are happening to Rogue, Paladin, Mage, and Neutral? And my response is this video, because I just want to have something that I can send people to and be like, this is my predicted tier list. And number 1 is Ticketus Warlock. I think Ticketus Warlock is absolutely nuts right now. I think it's like the 7th best deck in the game right now. Personally, maybe 8th, but let's be clear. The first 3 are all Paladin decks. The next one is Mage, and then also a Rogue deck in there with Miracle Rogue or Watchpost Rogue, whichever one you want to play. And then comes, I think, Face Hunter, because it does well into Mage. Token Druid is underrated. And then Ticketus Warlock. These 5 decks, nerfed. These 3 decks rise to the top. Ticketus Warlock can beat the other 2 top decks. That's its whole point. It's a really good control deck, and it will be number 1. And when the meta slows down, because there isn't as much like insane early game tempo or crazy RNG with Mage, control decks will rise in the meta again, which means that Ticketus will have another good thing going for it, because you do really well into control decks because you burn a lot of their cards. Ticketus Warlock is going to be the most dominant deck in the game by a pretty wide margin, and if I'm wrong, well then I'm sorry, but I can say with like 75% certainty this will be at least a top 3 deck after the nerf. Okay, so other than Ticketus at like the undisputed top of my tier list, I think it's going to be absolutely bonkers. We have just a ton of decks right below that, which I think are all going to be good, but it's way too early to like say which one's going to be better than the others, right? So this is just a good clump of good decks. And the first one is Token Druid. I think Token Druid is really good right now. It's hard for a lot of control decks to deal with it because of how many resources you can generate quickly. It has pretty consistent draw. Even if you hit late game, you have good resource generation with like Gibberling, Solar Eclipse, Arbor Up, fill the board, get giant amounts of minions out there, and you can just win the game off of that for just 8 mana. Not to mention the fact that you have other cards like Innervate and Lightning Bloom, so you could sometimes wiggle in Soul of the Forest in there as well. Overall, this deck looks really promising, and I think that it has some of the best potential of other decks out there, because it doesn't really summon that many minions, and it has really good value already, so if people run more Watch Posts, this deck will do better. And I think Watch Posts might get nerfed, so I don't think that there's a lot that can counter this deck right now. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that this deck will be in that tier 2 category behind Ticketus Warlock, which is tier 1. Next we have Face Hunter, and Face Hunter is a deck that I'm a little bit iffy about, and I think it's either going to do really, really well or really, really badly, and it depends on how many control decks rise in the meta and how many people start running Watch Posts. Because if both of those things go way up, Face Hunter, not even going to be a deck. Like, it won't even exist. It absolutely gets blasted by Control Warlock and Control Priest, and if those 2 decks see more play and Watch Posts see more play, which slow this deck down also, this is just going to be a deck that basically falls apart. However, if the deck or if the meta goes more of a mid-range route that just tries to do like decent damage and play tempo, I think Face Hunter will do well because of how fast that it is. So overall, I think this one's kind of iffy. It's either going to be a high or a low. And I think the average is around tier 2, but it could very easily be a tier 3 or 4 deck. But I think that this one has potential. It's fairly cheap as well. You only really need Rinling's Rifle as your legendary, and if you don't have it and you absolutely can't craft it, you could just run a Piercing Shot for a little bit of extra damage, and it's pretty solid. So overall, yeah, that's it for these decks. We're still moving on. The video's not over. I don't know why I ended that. So the next deck on this list is Control Priest, and I think that this is a very interesting deck to talk about because I think that right now I'm currently 9-1 with this deck. I'm beating a lot of mages, I'm beating some druids. I think it does well into a lot of the aggro decks that I think might potentially rise right when the nerfs happen. But it loses really hard to Ticketus Warlock. I know this from experience last expansion. Obviously I haven't played against a Warlock here, but I've played against enough Control Priests as Control Warlock and enough Control Warlocks as Control Priest to know that Warlock almost 100% wins that matchup, because if they Ticketus and they burn even just one Cthulhu piece, you are an absolute sitting duck. And because of that, if Ticketus Warlock, like I'm predicting, actually becomes the number 1 deck in the game, absolutely dominates, and becomes played by like 25 to 30% of the community, then this deck will struggle. But even if Ticketus Warlock is only like one notch below that, I think that this deck has a lot of potential. It's already currently very good, and it does well against mid-range and aggro decks. So I think that this has a lot of potential. I would try this deck out if you haven't. It is a pretty high skill cap deck from what I've experienced, but you could definitely learn to play it and get a lot of value. So hopefully you guys enjoyed. I don't know why I keep ending like that. There are more decks on this tier list. What am I doing? The next deck on this tier list is some sort of Frenzy Warrior, because I think that you have a couple of things going for you, right? You have a lot of weapons, and with not too many weapon removals in the game right now, that's a plus, which means you can do direct damage and your opponent can't interact with it very much. You've got some pretty beefy, strong minions that put value on the board the opponent is forced to respond to. And then you have not really an OTK, but like close to an OTK. ETC, Playmaker, and one bumper car. And then you play, obviously, the minions you get off the Deathrattle is a 16 damage combo. So if you can get them down to 16 HP, you're fine. And considering the fact that a lot of your minions are not like super big, but they are solid, like 4 and 3 attack, it means that Control Priest can't really kill it because they use words like Shadow Word Ruin and Shadow Word Pain. But you also have like pretty solid late game. Because you're able to generate a lot of minions. You have weapons. The Overlord Surfang allows you to draw extra cards from the Stone Maul Anchorman. And just overall, this deck has a lot of things going for it. It's just a really good tempo deck that has pretty decent mid and late game. And I've had great success with it myself. I'm currently 8-3 with it, and I think that it will continue this trend of being good. And its only real counter is like hard aggro that can do a lot of burst damage, because this deck doesn't have that much armor gain. But like I said, I think aggro might not be that strong, because Control Priest and Control Warlock are going to be so strong in my opinion. So overall, I think this deck has a lot of potential. A couple of things need to go right for this deck to be good, but I do think that this deck has a lot of potential. The next deck on this list is a mage deck, and I think it's one that does not receive enough credit, and it's Midrange Mage. It does almost as much damage. Well, okay, obviously it can't do almost as much damage as a high roll Lunacy Mage, but it does almost as much damage as a Lunacy Mage that does like average. It generates a lot of resources, has pretty good tempo and good finishing power with Agwin, which allows you to get a ton of spell damage and burst them down with cards like Fireball and the Ruined Orb and Mask of Cthulhu and all that jazz. Overall, this deck for me personally has already gone 4-2, and I think with the other decks being nerfed, this mid-range deck has enough damage and sustain to potentially do well after the nerfs. I will admit, if Far Watch Post ends up getting nerfed, you might want to take it out for a little more burst, like another Lab Partner and another Mask of Cthulhu, but that is that's just up for you to decide if that ends up happening. So overall, this deck is pretty solid. I don't want to focus too much on it though, because Mage is already so dominant in the meta, and let's move on to the next one. I think Deathrattle Demon Hunter has a lot of potential, like a lot. It's already a pretty solid deck, and because I'm currently 5-2 with it, and I feel like it really only loses to like high value Mage and Paladin matchups that can get rolling before you're able to do anything. The amount of damage you're able to put out with this deck and the amount of resources you can generate with Skull of Gul'dan and Chaos Strike and the Tusk Piercer to draw cards along with the Vengeful Spirit. All these things mean that you're not going to run out of resources. You have constant minion generation because your minions, like Razor Boar and Razor Fen, and also the Renowned Performer, generate more minions when they die. And then you have a great finishing potential with Illidari and the Death Speaker, which is another draw engine and a great way to put minions on the board and apply pressure. I actually really think this deck is good. Like, I think this deck is not top tier right now because there are other decks that are better, but once those decks get nerfed, and considering where I think the meta might go, I think Deathrattle Demon Hunter has a pretty decent amount of potential. And doesn't really require that many legendaries. Like, you could also take out the Ace Hunter Crane for something else if you want. Like, you could run a late game win condition card if you wanted, like an Alex Straza at the end of the game to potentially finish him off if you wanted something later. Or if you just want more draw, you can take out, like, like I said, Ace Hunter Crane and put in another Vengeful Spirit to draw a couple more cards. Like, there's a few things you can do to make the deck a little bit more consistent, but overall, it's quite strong. Last deck on this list is Aggro Shaman, and the reason why I think this deck is going to be on this list is because it's an aggro deck that relies on burst. It's the same basic thing as Midrange Mage. You get spell damage and spells, and you can kill the opponent without relying on minions, which can get removed, which means that Priest and Warlock might not be able to deal with it that well unless they tech in weapon removal. And if they tech in weapon removal, and weapon removal becomes like super common, this deck will suffer quite a bit because its main win condition is Doomhammer. But if there isn't that much weapon removal, then this deck will absolutely dominate because of how much damage it'll be able to do really, really quickly. And the last note I want to say, because this is the last deck I want to talk about, obviously I think Rogue and Paladin and, like I said, one Mage deck, like also Hero Power Mage might be pretty decent actually. But like I said, these three classes are going to need to be nerfed really hard for them to be irrelevant. I still think that they're going to be middle of the class or like upper middle decks and classes just because they were already so strong to begin with. And it really depends on how hard the decks get nerfed and if they nerf the correct things. So if the nerf isn't hard or doesn't nerf the correct things, they'll probably main top tier. And if the nerfs are just, normal, which balance them out a little bit, I think they're still going to be good decks because they rely on a lot of, like, interesting synergies that are powerful in their own right. Like, it's not necessarily just the power level of the cards, it's just the playstyle of the deck is really hard to deal with sometimes. So because of that, I do think that Paladin and Mage and Rogue will still be in this caliber of decks that are good. They just won't be, like, super dominant. And that's basically what I'm getting at here. The rest of these decks are going to be fine. And yeah, hopefully you guys enjoy. If you do, feel free to like, comment, subscribe. This is just an early tier list on what I think will be good when the nerfs come out. And, yeah, and for those of you who are watching this because I linked it to you on stream, because you asked me, what do you think is going to be good after the nerfs? This is the video.